Hello Year 11. Hope you're all having a nice holiday and hope the revision's going well for those of you who are revising. So here is video number 2 of the series that I said I was going to do about significant figures in the civil rights movement. And the person I want to talk to you about today is Malcolm X. Okay, so talked in the last video about Martin Luther King. Today I want to talk about Malcolm X and why he is significant in the civil rights movement. So to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about Malcolm X's background, the background to Malcolm X. So a couple of interesting things about Malcolm X that are good to know about. It's kind of help you understand his character and the things that he does. Well, here you go. So first of all, he joined a group called the Nation of Islam that I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail later on. So he joined a group called the Nation of Islam in the 1940s while he was in prison for burglary. And around about the same time, he changed his name from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X. And the reason why he did that second point there, was he said that Little is the name of my ancestors' owners. So it's a slave name. That's what, so Little isn't my name. It's the name of a white family who owned my ancestors who were slaves, who were enslaved people. So therefore I don't want that name. It's a slave name. We talked again about the example of Muhammad Ali as well. His original name was obviously Cassius Clay, and he did the same thing. He said Clay is the slave name. I don't want to be Cassius Clay. I want to be Muhammad Ali. So Malcolm X did the same thing. So there are a couple of interesting things about Malcolm X that I think kind of give an indication as to some of the things that he did later on. So thinking about the last video that I did and thinking about Martin Luther King as a figure, here's a couple of questions to consider. So first of all, what were Malcolm X's views and how did he differ from Martin Luther King? Well, firstly, I mentioned before, then I'll leave this up here. I mentioned the Nation of Islam before. Now, Malcolm X had joined the Nation of Islam because he shared several of their views. Firstly, he was a Muslim, called the Nation of Islam. That kind of gives a bit of a clue there. But so he shared that view, the religious view. But more so, he agreed with the Nation of Islam's views that, here you go, their views that racial integration, so black people and white people mixing together, living together, sharing the same facilities, etc., society, would not bring equality or end discrimination because white people would always consider themselves superior. African Americans should be segregated from whites, but should have the same standard of facilities until they can have a state of their own. So let me kind of explain that in a bit more detail. So what they believed, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam believed, was, look, white people and black people, in America anyway, are never going to be able to mix because the white people are always going to have this superiority complex, if you will. They're always going to see themselves as better and superior, as kind of a bit of a hangover, if you will, from the days of slavery, when white people owned black people. So there's always going to be that kind of hangover. So white people and black people aren't going to be able to live together in equality. White people will always see themselves as better or superior. So therefore we can't have integration. It just won't work. So what we do need is, well, in the long run, we need a separate state for African Americans to live in. So a black state, if you will. That's what we need in the long run. But before we get there, what we do need is segregation. We do need to segregate African Americans and white Americans from each other because they can't live together peacefully. But what we do need to do, and obviously some of you, well, you know all this stuff anyway, but some of you are probably sitting there going, well, actually they had segregation. They had a lot of segregation, particularly in the Deep South. They had loads of segregation. Nearly everything was segregated. So they already had that. The difference is the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X were saying, yeah, but it's not equal. It's not separate but equal, as the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling said. White schools are better than black schools. White lunch counters are better than black lunch counters, etc. So, yes, by all means have segregation, but it does need to be separate. It does need to be equal, sorry. It does need to be separate but equal. So this is clearly, going back to that question from before, this is clearly very different from the likes of Martin Luther King and the other groups that we've looked at, because Martin Luther King and the other groups that we've looked at have been campaigning for integration. But here Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were saying that that wasn't possible and that segregation was needed, the only difference being that it did need to be equal, separate but equal. Now, Malcolm X was very, very critical of Martin Luther King. Malcolm X was, and this is kind of like the headline, I think, really, that he was very much at the forefront of a different kind of civil rights protest from Martin Luther King's non-violence. Martin Luther King has been saying, look, non-violent, peaceful protest, that's the way forward. And Malcolm X is totally different to that, or very different to that. Malcolm X had said that retaliating to white violence, he'd said that not retaliating to white violence was foolish. He said, you know, Martin Luther King saying turn the other cheek and, you know, don't fight back. That's just foolish. It's not going to get you anywhere. So Malcolm X says, look, you know, if you meet violence with violence. If you are met with violence from white people, retaliate. He saw violence as, you know, justified as a response to white violence, and as a means of going on to achieve this separate black nation that I've mentioned before. He also, speaking of kind of differences between him and Martin Luther King, he also criticized the March on Washington. He called it the farce on Washington. A farce is kind of like a bit of a joke, kind of a bit of a mockery, if you will. So, so he said, look, the March on Washington isn't anything good. He actually said that it was a way of kind of appealing to or pandering to white people. That's the whole reason why this has been done. It's just to kind of, you know, give white people something nice and appeal to them and go, well, you know, we can be together. Which, you know, Malcolm X said that's not the way forward. Now, naturally, many people, loads of white people and quite a few black people as well, civil rights campaigners, saw Malcolm X as quite a controversial and quite a dangerous figure. As I say, you know, including many, it wasn't just, you know, white people who saw him as a dangerous, controversial figure. There were many African-American civil rights campaigners who saw him as quite controversial and quite dangerous. But he did have a significant level of support, particularly from young African Americans who lived in the cities, the urban African Americans, because he seemed to speak more to them or more about the issues that they were facing, the social issues, you know, about jobs and housing and whatnot. Whereas Martin Luther King did talk about those things, but obviously kind of focused on more of the things like voting and whatnot, and Malcolm X was kind of talking more directly to the issues that were affecting urban African Americans, young urban African Americans. So he did have some support as well. Now, what was his legacy? Because obviously the whole theme of this video is the significance of Malcolm X. Why was Malcolm X significant? What is his legacy? Well, just before I kind of go on to like the kind of main part of his legacy, he did actually, I'm going to mention this, he did change his views somewhat for two reasons. One, he'd actually left the Nation of Islam in 1964 when he fell out with the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad. So there was already kind of a movement there that he moved out of that group and started to change his views then. He also went on pilgrimage to Mecca. And when he went on pilgrimage to Mecca, he saw, which is obviously the holiest city in Islam, he saw, when he got there, Muslims of all races, you know, black people, white people, Asian people, people from all over the world, living together, working together and being together and treating each other equally, basically, you know, coexisting. And, you know, that made him think, well, actually, they can do it. So maybe, you know, we can coexist back in America. And he started to change his views a little bit, but this was right at the end of his life, because this was kind of in the mid-60s, and he was, of course, assassinated in 1965, which we've looked at in class. But his legacy, going back to what I was saying before, his legacy can really be seen in what happened in the civil rights movement in the mid to late 1960s. There was a rise in support or adoption of a lot of the views that he had been putting forward before. You know, black pride, violence as a means of self-defense. even though, you know, he had started to change his views a little bit on these things, these were some of the ideas that were prevalent later on in the mid to late 1960s. Again, as I said before, you know, Black Pride, you know, Black Power, we've seen that. Saw that later on in the 1960s. Violence and self-defense. Look at the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party can almost trace its origins back to Malcolm X. He had nothing to do with the Black Panther Party because he died in 1965 and the Black Panther Party wasn't set up until 1966. So they are separate, but you can see that the Black Panther Party really does adopt a lot of Malcolm X's earlier views anyway about you know, Black Pride and about the violence and self-defense, etc. So that's very much his legacy, that later on, when you've got Black Panthers, you've got the whole Black Power movement, and even, you know, the student groups becoming a bit more violent as well. You can kind of see the origins of that in some of the work of Malcolm X. So that is Malcolm X. Another 10 minutes on that. So Malcolm X, why he's significant. So I've covered Martin Luther King, covered Malcolm X. I'll see if I can squeeze in a few more of these significant civil rights figures videos between now and the exams. As always, any requests for any videos on civil rights, Germany, Middle East, First World War, just leave any comments in the comment section below for any requests. But again, hope that's been useful. Hope the revision is going well. Enjoy the rest of the Easter holidays, and I will see you very soon. Bye bye.